Hello everyone, my name is Anne McKenna. I'm a humanities publisher in the secondary division at Oxford, and I'm the publisher of the new edition of Inside History. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Thank you all for joining us today. It's great that so many of you have been able to join in. We're fairly new to webinar hosting, so I just ask that you be patient if we have any technical hiccups. Our new edition of Inside History has been written by two of the authors from the previous edition, Bruce Dennett and Bernie Howard, who are long-standing Oxford history authors, and they've been joined by a new member of the team, Emily Shanahan. Just to run through our agenda, first up, Bernie and Emily will talk about the importance of skills and concepts in history and how to embed them in stages 4 and 5 so students are prepared for stage 6. Then they'll look at how to use the various features in the books to help students make decisions and think for themselves. Following that, our New South Wales Secondary Sales Manager, Kelly James, will give a demonstration of our teacher dashboard and explain about the purchasing options. After that, we'll have time for some questions. I'll now hand over to Emily and Bernie to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Shanahan and I'm a history teacher at Northern Beaches Christian School. I've had the most wonderful time being involved in this project. It was very exciting for me to be part of something so amazing, working with two really experienced authors, but being able to also have a look at practical application of pedagogical approaches to make sure that we have the best possible resource for our history classrooms. Over to you, Bernie.
Thanks, Emily. And you can see straight away why we were very keen to get Emily involved, because she's young, enthusiastic and intelligent. Because you notice you keep hearing the word experienced, which basically means we're old, Bruce and I. So it was great to have an influx of enthusiasm and youth and, relevant classroom experience. So I think between us, we've hopefully got a very good team that can produce a lot of experience and enthusiasm that teaches you to make history live in the classroom, which is what we really want to do. And we're going to start off looking at the skills and how we've tried to embed those into the book. And within the last edition, the Historian's Toolkit was at the back of the book. It's been moved to the front so that both teachers and students can feel comfortable with the skills and concepts that are integral to succeeding in history. We felt it was important to give these a focus, and one of the things I think you'll find working through the Historian's Toolkit is that it firstly gives students that confidence that what they're encountering isn't some strange alien world, but these are terms that they will be coming across on a daily basis, and giving them the understanding that will help them unpack the material they'll come up with in the next 4 or 6 years. And also for teachers, I think there's a really important role for the toolkit to play with teachers, because we're all aware that it can often be someone's first history class, or they're teaching outside their subject area, and the Historian's Toolkit is particularly designed to help them as well by showing practical examples of how these skills and concepts are applied throughout the course. And I'm sure you're all very much aware of these concepts that are embedded deeply throughout the whole of the stage 4 and 5 syllabuses, and then are built on again in stage 6. And I think one of the things that's really important for us to convey is this idea that Inside History has been created to be part of a suite of books that take students from the first class of Year 7 to the HSC exam, building their understanding of these concepts and the skills, seeing them in the context with which they appear, and then being able to move deeper and deeper as they work their way through the courses of history. And that toolkit should be quite a familiar image if you've been using the previous edition. And you can see there that the skills are they're very clear, but for a Year 7 history student, perhaps encountering some of these for the first time, and by seeing them in the context and going through and giving you a couple of lessons if you wish to take them to work through what these things are about, I think will build a very much a a base that can be built on very successfully throughout the ensuing years. And this is to sort of try and get across what we're trying to do. The skills and concepts need to be made explicit. They need to be constantly revisited if students are going to really be able to understand them and, more importantly, apply them. And to do that, they need to see these skills and concepts in action, regardless of the historical context that they're working in, that they apply equally across all contexts. And so the approach we've taken is this step approach that in year 7, as they become comfortable with them, they're starting to get on that right track of understanding, building up in year 8, really consolidating their understanding in year 9. And by year 10, we've gone so deep, and you can see we're much further along the track, and students now have really got the groundwork to succeed in senior history. And I guess that's one of the things we're really hoping that by the end of, and we've worked hard to sort of try and ensure that it happens, that by the end of year 10, students can enter senior history feeling confident and comfortable that they know what the subject's about, that they can enjoy it, and they know what's required to succeed. And I think if we can give them that in year 10, it will build for success in year 11 and 12. So to start unpacking some of these features, I'd like to turn you back to Emily. Thanks.
So as Bernie was saying, the idea behind the Spotlight features is so that students can actually start to take ownership of their learning and take the ownership of how they're going about becoming a historian. So for me, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I've got the microphone, so I'm going to say it anyway. The thing that I hate when I'm planning and programming is pointing out all the nitty-gritty things that I'm doing within the syllabus, because I know what we need to teach. We have the syllabus in front of us that tells us about the content, the stories, the stuff that we all signed up to be history teachers for. And so it can seem onerous at times when you're suddenly asked to map in and embed the historical skills and concepts. We all do that inherently all the time, but when we have to actually spell it out in programs and we have to justify it to all of the people checking off the curriculum for accreditation and compliance matters, it can sort of detract from all the fun stuff that is history. So for me, it's been really exciting to see embedded right there into the content explanations just on the side of the text, so they don't detract from what the students are doing at the time, but they really do highlight those historical skills and those historical concepts. And this does serve a number of purposes. First of all, you can set up assessment tasks and students have live examples that they can go back to see what research might entail, where comprehension might be a feature of a unit. They can have a look at analysis and use of sources. They can focus on looking at contestability, and it provides a snapshot with an explanation or a justification as to how this marked part in the text represents that key skill or that key concept that we're actually trying to teach them. So for me, it means that if teachers are away, if you've got teachers who are not from a history teaching background, they can actually be doing all of those things that we naturally and inherently do as historians in the classroom with our students. So this is a little snapshot from the Year 7 textbook. And there's an example here of cause and effect. Now, we know automatically what cause and effect means to us, but when you're in Year 7 and we don't know what sort of history understanding they might have gained in their K-6 experience, although hopefully with the Australian curriculum it's a bit more standardised across all school systems now, but it actually explains what the cause and what the effect is. And the hope is that with having these Spotlight features, students will be able to recognise those skills and concepts straight away, and they'll be able to apply those and map that out in other parts of their study. This is one where I think it's really going to be quite important when we have a look at perspective and contestability. These can be really difficult concepts for students, particularly in Year 7, to grapple with. Historiography is something that we often only associate with students who are doing extension history in Year 12. But if we start to teach perspectives, contestability as we're meant to, it means that Year 7 are not going to be thrown by these concepts as they progress through Stage 4, Stage 5 and Stage 6. And so what it does is it breaks it down to a beginner's level so that students can understand that they are viewing history through different lenses, and we've spelled that out for them and for teachers so that you can actually demonstrate to your students what it is that they're achieving, and these transferable skills will apply across different things that they study. We can have a look at how this builds. because we're not just repeating the content in Year 7 and repeating the same skills. When you have a look at the syllabus, you will see that the historical skills and concepts are incredibly similar for Stage 4 and Stage 5. But what we're doing is we're unpacking them in more depth as we progress through the different year groups. And you'll see this in relation to how we present contestability, how we present things like empathetic understanding, so that students can start to recognise those skills that they've seen before. They can see how they're embedding that at a deeper level and gaining a much deeper understanding of not only history, but also the construction of history and how we as historians go about learning about the past. One of my favourite features, which is that of contestability. As I mentioned before, it's usually only when you get into those senior years that we're asking students to grapple with different perspectives, different interpretations of the past. And the reality is that in every single history lesson, we're already bringing in different perspectives. We're already talking about issues in history that are contested in different ways across different time periods. So by highlighting this and spotlighting it, it means that when you're setting research tasks, if you want to extend students or for students who need support, they have a clear example that they can refer to without it necessarily relating to the specific element that you might be studying further down. So we believe that this has actually brought greater depth, not only to the content and understanding what students are actually studying, but also for you as teachers to have those pedagogical approaches naturally embedded in. I don't think I've ever stood in a classroom and thought, oh, I must talk about contestability today, or I must tick off empathetic understanding. But what we have done is we've made sure that we've mapped that out for you, mapped it out for the students, so it's a user-friendly, ready-to-go guide that you can just pick up, love every minute of, and really get lost in those stories, because that's what the history is all about. I think I'm going to pass over to Bernie to talk about that a little bit further for years 9 and 10.
Thanks, Em. And moving into year 9, as Em said, it is a step approach. By year 9, continuity and change will be a familiar term, but as they start here in this example with the Industrial Revolution, it's pretty clear that there'll be the pre-industrial Britain is a long period of continuity, and all that they'll be studying as they work through the Industrial Revolution is change and its impact. So again, it's this idea of showing it within the context so students have a deeper understanding each time they encounter a skill or a concept. And this is where I think perspective particularly becomes really important, and one of my favourite spotlights. I was asked in the talk the webinar we did last week about fake news, and here we've got Hitler claiming that the German army had not really lost World War One. Now that's a clear example. Kids will understand as they're working through this material, hang on, that may not be factual. When I was at school, that was probably a shock to think that things weren't factual. You know, that someone could come out and say something that wasn't true, particularly a leader. In the age of Trump, we have no real problem understanding that leaders now say things that aren't necessarily factual. So that's become a critical skill to identify with students, where people that they may have heard about aren't necessarily always factual, and they need to do that research, particularly where so many non-factual perspectives can be circulated through social media. So this is, I think, a help. While we're consolidating their understanding of perspectives, we're also unpacking the world around them, the world they're growing up in, and giving them those skills they need to make sense of that world. As you can see, another year 9 one, explanation and communication. And you have a photo there. This is the case study for the war chapter, and looking at local commemoration. And in the bottom left-hand side of the double-page spread there, you have a photo of the first Australia Day held at Gosford on the Central Coast in 1915. And it raises the problem that most students be aware that they think of January the 26th as Australia Day, but the fact the first Australia Day was the 30th of July 1915, and it was to raise funds for World War One. So it's important to get them to think, well, if someone says, you're wrong, how do you build an argument? How do you explain that, no, the first Australia Day was actually 1915? And it's important that students are aware that that's what they need to be able to do in history. Build arguments, explain and communicate your understanding and your evidence clearly. And just by doing a simple exercise like that in Year 9 will again give them that confidence that they can succeed in history. And so we've got here significance in the Declaration of Human Rights and getting students to think about, is it significant because it's a landmark document, or is it significant because it has its potential to improve lives across the globe? Now, and this is something that students really need to understand. There may not always be a correct answer, but as they make a decision, they have to provide the evidence to support their decision. And that's making them a much stronger history student. Here we're looking in the Rights and Freedoms chapter at the use of the terms full-blooded and mixed blood, which are today regarded as highly offensive. They're used, we explain that they're used in the book because it's the context, that the language of the historical period that we're looking at, but also point out that if you're talking about this period, it's not appropriate for you to use these terms today in anything but an historical context. And as we deal with issues of racism in Australia, as recently as, Friday night's rugby league, it's important that students have got an understanding of language and the power of language to hurt as well as to help. And so these are the sorts of issues that by engaging with these in Year 10, we feel, and it's not intrusive, it's there in context, it's part of what they're dealing with. It enables them to become very familiar with doing that for themselves in Years 11 and 12. And now I'd like to turn over to Emily again to look at the questions that we've been embedding into the text.
So while you've just heard from Bernie about all the fun stuff that's happening, he gets to talk about the story. I thought I'd talk to you about something that is actually, for me as a teacher, something that I'm very conscious of. Now, I know that we're all altruistic in our approach and we want students to love learning and engage in learning for the sake of it. But at the end of the day, we also need to achieve results. We need to demonstrate that students are achieving and that they are improving each year as they go on. And something that has been a really rewarding experience for me is having the opportunity to be able to go and backwards map and have a look at where we want our students to be in Year 12, particularly with the new syllabus that's now been underway. We've had our first HSC exams for it last year, second one's coming up in the not too distant future, and to have a look at how those question styles can actually work back down through Years 10, 9, 8 and 7 so that they're not unfamiliar by the time they're getting to that HSC preparation stage. So for us, what we wanted to do is make sure that we had questions that were accessible to all students. You'll see differentiation readily applied in each of the question sections when we're asking students to reflect on their learning. Now with this, it does mean that we've got some that are just reviewing the content and understanding what's happening, perhaps synthesizing information from different areas and putting that into their own words. But we've made sure too that there are plenty of opportunities for students to apply and analyse their thinking, and you'll see this mapped out under a clear heading. Now, of course, when you have a look at the Australian Australian curriculum general capabilities, you know that we all have to embed ICTs into our teaching. We also need to be making sure that our students become critical and creative thinkers. And so these textbooks are not just about teaching students about the past and what happened in terms of fact, but we're actually helping you as teachers guide students so that they learn how to think and they learn how to critique and how to analyse. Because at the end of the day, when they're sitting those HSC exams, they can know all the information in the world, but unless they actually have that understanding of critique and analysis behind them and have put that into practice across a number of years, there's no way that they're going to be able to just readily sit down and complete those exams. So you'll see Bloom's taxonomy coming through as we actually stagger the questions. When you have a look at the marker notes from HSC feedback centres and things like that, you see that there's band mapping where certain questions wanted to target students in a band 1 range through a band 6. So what we've done is we've made sure that in each of our chapters, in each of the textbooks, we've got a similar approach. And this means that students can actually achieve and be successful in everything that they're learning. There's something in there for everyone. But on top of that, we really encourage the thought process. We want students to understand that there's no right or wrong answer if they can back up their thinking with evidence that they are supporting. And that's another thing that we do, is we make sure that we've got through the interpret questions that skill being developed of using sources to support their understanding. As we move on to the next slide, you'll see in the Year 7 textbook an example of what I'm talking about. Now, if any of you have been thrown into a Year 11 modern or ancient history class and haven't taught it before, you might come across questions where you have to suddenly become a scientist or a mathematician in order to actually have students answer their questions. So what we thought we'd do is take some of those skills and approaches that you do see in the Year 11 course with construction of history or investigating the ancient past, and we've put that into the topics where they fit for Year 7, 8, 9 and 10. So for example, in question 3 that you can see here under Apply and Analyse, how has technology enhanced our understanding of the human remains at Lake Mungo? This could actually be a question that students could sit in Year 11. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them to grapple with these concepts, have a look at cross-curricular opportunities for students to see that history isn't something they're going to study in isolation. And this is, of course, what makes it one of the best and most important subjects for any student to study. But they'll be able to actually bring in their other interests, their other loves, such as technology or scientific approaches, and apply that to what they're studying. Now, our hope is that because this is just going to become second nature to students, by the time they do hit those exams in Year 12, they're really well prepared. If we move on to the next slide with Year 8, I think you'll see an example in question 5 where we're not actually telling students what they should think about the particular topic in relation to Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples. We're not saying that it was an invasion, that it was an occupation, that it was colonisation. Now, hopefully that will all come through very clearly in the text that they have studied. But this is an opportunity where students can actually define these for themselves, and it means they're already thinking about things from a different perspective. So it's really guided, it's really scaffolded, and students don't realise that they're engaging with higher order content, and it just means that they're opening their world to these types of questions and this type of thinking from a much younger age than we might otherwise have done. I'll pass on to Bernie to show how this can go further when we have a look at Years 9 and 10, and you'll see that it continues to build in terms of the skill development.
And here we can see in Year 9 in the Making a Nation topic, and having spent my whole career in comprehensive high schools, I'm acutely aware of not setting a bar that limits student understanding, because far too many kids get condemned, oh, you're in the bottom class, you can't do anything. And I've taught a B stream Year 7 girl who ended up coming third in the state in society and culture. So I'm very much aware that we try to set questions that will give students that opportunity to push themselves and feel comfortable doing it. So example, looking at going deeper here, where we're looking to push kids that little bit further, just find out why where you live is where it is, and use the types of factors you've already looked at in the text to unpack, well, why is your suburb there? Why is your town there? And then we've talked a lot about the importance of looking at new scholarship in new editions, and so we get students to think about what the Dark Emu thesis and the impact that's now having on Australian history. It's not difficult for them to find somewhere where those arguments have been put forward and where there are criticisms. So without saying to them, here, let's get ourselves into the history wars, let's really go deep in historiography, we're pointing them in that direction in a way that every student can access it. And that's what I really believe that very strongly, that it's absolutely fundamental that every student has an opportunity to find their place in history. And here's a whole suite of questions put together just at the end of one of the sections in popular culture. You can see there's the basic review and understand questions where you find basic important facts. You know, what were the songs that meant that rock and roll had arrived in Australia? Where did they come from? There's a whole, ideas that can go further there. When was television broadcast? When did all state capitals have TV stations? And then go that little bit deeper. So as a class, discuss the idea that 1956 was a significant year for popular culture in Australia. And toss around this idea. Yeah, it's not a fact, it's an opinion that it's a significant year. Is there any historical basis to that opinion? Then have a bit of fun. Script a discussion between a father and a daughter watching Elvis perform on the Milton Berle show, and that was the show. That was the performance that got him banned from the waist down. And America, middle class America was horrified at the idea of young girls screaming and getting so excited watching Elvis. And so to teach them about social and cultural context, make sure it's in 56. Think about how being in 1956 is different to having that argument with your own parents. And finally, in trying to embed the different subjects in their learning and integrate them, here's a bit of maths to work out how much a TV cost in 1956. It was 13 times the average weekly wage. Find out, do some research. What is the current average weekly wage now for a full-time worker? What is 13 times that cost? How does that compare to the cost of a TV today? What does that tell you? So even I could almost do that maths myself. So it's about taking students and giving them the opportunity to think and to build on this idea of thinking for yourself. I'll go back to Emily now to talk about the way we're using sources to do that as well.
So I mentioned briefly before that we do have questions where you interpret material from the sources. And I think if we, here we go. We've got Year 7. Now, I know that this is an extract from our Year 7 textbook, but I thought I'd jump ahead again to the HSC because, like I said, this is what we're working towards when we're actually teaching and developing these skills throughout high school. And if you have a look at this question, you could actually see something very similar in an HSC examination. Because what it's doing, although it hasn't necessarily used the same words, in the HSC you might see things like, what does the evidence reveal about a particular topic, or what can you interpret from this particular source? What we've done is we've broken that down into a starting point for Year 7, and we build it, and you will see as you progress through the different textbooks that more and more we're using the HSC verbs when we're asking questions. But with this one here, we're asking students to identify wealthy women and also the attending slaves or servants. They also have to write a short description of the scene. So while we haven't said, what does the evidence reveal, we're starting them to get involved in that process of historical thinking. They have actually had to have a look at the source and work out who or what is in the picture, what is actually being depicted, and they have to draw conclusions. Now, the conclusions they're drawing at this stage in Year 7 are quite simple. They're drawing conclusions about the wealthy women, and they're drawing conclusions about those who are attending them. Now, they may not be accurate conclusions, but it's a starting point so that we can continue to build and get students used to this way of using evidence as the starting point and using that to reveal the history. And this is something that you'll see time and time again, particularly in the newer style of the HSC exam. If we move on to the next slide, we've got an example from Year 8. And this is actually one of my favourite ones because I think that when a lot of us saw the sample exams before the first HSC exams last year in 2019, there are a lot of questions that were posed quite differently to what we'd seen for many years prior in the HSC exams. There were things asking us to compare sources, asking us about the value and the limitations of sources. And this is something that we've tried to embed all the way through Year 7, 8, 9 and 10 in these textbooks so that when students get to Years 11 and 12, you really can focus on the content and they've got a really solid foundation for those skills and concepts. So with this example from Year 8 that we've highlighted here today, you've got a pre-Columbian record and you've also got a European interpretation of a meeting that took place. We're actually setting the scene for the students. We're actually letting them know where these different sources have come from. And then we're asking them to compare and contrast them to draw conclusions, to think about how reliable, how useful, how valuable these sources might be. And while you don't see them here, as you progress through the textbook, you'll see different question types, and instead of framing and actually constructing this thought process, it'll jump straight to what's the value of these sources, what are the limitations. So what we're doing each step along the way is making sure that we're setting students up for success, showing them the process of historical thinking so that they can start to and then continue applying and embedding that into their own historical quests and searches as they go. I think we'll hand over to Bernie. He's going to talk a little bit more about how this progresses as we hit years 9 and year 10.
Thanks, Emily. And here we are at, the World War I conscription debates and looking at those sources to one for, one against. So straight away, students are getting the opportunity to identify perspectives and look at one in depth. We're not saying you've got to be for or against conscription, but pick one, analyse it, and think for yourself, why is it more effective? And that's, again, the type of gentle introduction to what's required in senior source studies that will enable it to become second nature for them when they hit the HSC, where it's not something that they feel has been imposed on them. They understand that it's how they do history. And one of my favourites about perspective and looking at sources to understand perspectives. This is a letter to the editor in January 1957 where a man called John Sutton, not the South Sydney captain who won the premiership for South in 2014, I should add, who wrote a letter complaining about the repulsive antics. This is just as Bill Haley's arriving in Australia, and he does make the famous quote that I used to think was just this apocryphal quote that never existed. Then I saw John Sutton writing in the Sydney Sun in 1957 saying that rock and roll represents a serious threat to the community. And balanced against that is a letter John Manners wrote to me. John Manners went on to become the bass player for the Whispers. Ray Brown and the Whispers had their first 3 songs go to #1. He was a young teenager who went to that concert. And I'm going to write down for me what he remembered. And he talks about seeing the first time he'd ever seen or heard a bass guitar was at Sydney Stadium. And he knew that that's what he wanted to do and that's what he wanted to play. And he said, the crowd reaction was sensational. No one had ever seen or heard anything like it before. So on one hand, you've got students looking and saying, well, it's a serious threat to the community, is it? On the other hand, you've got kids saying, you know what, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. So already they've been introduced to that generation gap and the way that age can affect and impact on your perspective. Now, you've heard both Em and I talk about probably the single most important motivating factor throughout the whole 4 books is to not be a deliverer of content, but encourage students to think for themselves. And in doing that, making sense of their world. Now, this is just an example how you can use the skills and concepts. If in the environment chapter, we look at the Denora smog incident in 1948 and how people actually couldn't go outside when these factories, there was a cloud inversion and the smog just descended and was killing people left, right and centre in the US, and no one could go out. And, we've set an empathetic understanding spotlight there saying, well, how does that compare to your experience? How does your experience during lockdown this year help you understand what happened at Denora in 1948? And in doing that, we're hopefully giving students that opportunity, hang on, I'm the only person that can answer this question because it's about me, and thinking again for themselves and placing themselves in the subject. Here's my favourite source in the whole 4 books. I personally think that the Earthrise photo from Apollo 8 on Christmas Eve 1968 is the single most important image that was produced in the whole of the 20th century. It was that photo that changed global perspective on our place on Earth, who we were, where we were, and what we needed to do in the future. And that's why I've always made sure that that photo is right up front in any chapter on the environment, because that single photo changed so much. And what want kids to do there is think for themselves in the visible thinking prompts that Emily will talk about in a moment. What do you see? What do you think? What does it make you wonder? And I mean, that was easy for me to write because I sit and wonder at that photo every time I see it, which is as soon as I walk outside the door here. And just looking at how we use these visible thinking prompts, here's one in the migration chapter where we talk about when the Vietnam War ended, Australia opened up its doors willingly to people fleeing from that conflict and reflected a humane refugee policy and a sense of moral obligation. So discuss with a partner that response that saw Australia emerge as a genuinely multicultural company and share your thoughts with the class. So it'd be very interesting to see, given the context of our migration policies at the moment, that not that long ago, we took a totally different approach. And again, it's about thinking, sharing, discussing. And again, looking at the film Gallipoli and the way that that was used, that had such an impact on Australian culture. Given that when the film Gallipoli was being made, they looked for federal funding and were told, no, the federal government is not interested in contributing to Gallipoli because there's no future. Who's going to be interested in a film about Gallipoli? Now, that's 1982. So think about how much we have changed and how much that film has done to change things. And so, again, there's a little prompt for them. I used to think, now I think, what has changed your understanding? So I'll turn over to Emily, whose brainchild the visible thinking prompts were, to just explain a little bit more about them. Over to you, Emily.
So the purpose behind the visible thinking prompts was to make sure that we do have a range of skills and strategies embedded into the textbooks that are going to serve a purpose of keeping up with current trends, but not just any trends that actually work and work for history teaching. So if we consider the one that Bernie mentioned about see, think and wonder, where we're looking at that fabulous image from outer space, it's actually asking students to analyse and interpret sources. They're doing it in a really safe environment. It's off on the side of the text. It doesn't feel like it's an accessible component or whatever, and it appears in every chapter. And the idea is that we're actually encouraging students to see, think and wonder for themselves so that they start to develop a curiosity about everything that they're seeing when they open up their textbook, when they go on the internet, when they're looking around in the world around them, because this is the process of historical thought. With the Think, Pair, Share, the key motivation behind this was to make sure that students had the opportunity not to be persuaded by what we as the teachers are saying in the classroom or what their classmates might be saying in a full class discussion, but to get them to actually articulate their thoughts in a small set and environment, but then have to justify their position to the rest of the class. Because this is really at the core of what we're trying to get students to do in the Stage 4 and Stage 5 syllabus, is to think historically and to back it up with evidence. And so the purpose behind that visible thinking prompt is to make sure that students all do have the opportunity to articulate a response and justify it, not just those who are the most verbal or vocal within the class. And finally, with the I used to think and now I think, the method to that madness there was to make sure that we're really preparing students for when they get into Stage 6, and you see it particularly in, I guess, the Year 12 core topic for Pompeii and Herculaneum, where they have to have a look at changing interpretations or changing understandings based on new evidence becoming available. So what we're asking students to do is to think about what they used to think on a particular topic. And in that small space of time while they've been studying that unit, they've been exposed to new information, new ideas, and a new perspective and new ways of looking at things. And so we want them to then reflect on what this new information means for their changed understanding. And the hope is that then students will be able to apply that in other contexts, such as in the Year 12 Ancient History HSC exam, when they have to look at changing interpretations or understandings with new evidence becoming available for Pompeii and Herculaneum. So all the way through, we're preparing students so that they can think historically as Nessa would like them to do. Another way that we do this is through the introduction of case studies for each and every chapter from Year 7 all the way through to Year 10. Now, as I mentioned before, we all love the stories, we all get excited by different things, and I think that this is where you'll see our love as authors coming through in units that we love to teach. So you will see some that focus on new ideas or new interpretations. You will see many that actually reflect on COVID experiences to make sure that we're keeping the thinking relevant and current for students, and also so that they can empathise and make sure that they have a point of connection, showing them how different points in history might affect people in similar yet vastly different ways as well. But really, it's to pique interest. It's to make sure that students know that there is so much more outside the classroom that we can't possibly teach them. It gives them a snapshot of something that may not be directly spelled out in the syllabus, but as we go through, I'll show you how they actually do link to the syllabus, but they're kind of an added extra, a little bundle of fun that you could possibly bring into your classroom at different points in time. So if we could move on to the next slide. We'll have a look at what's on offer for Year 7. Oh, sorry, this is just what they look like when you have a look at the case study. They are laid out, it'll specify a case study, and the purpose behind that is to make sure that you as a teacher know if you need to leave a lesson because you've got professional learning or anything like that, you can direct students to a case study. It may not necessarily have to be completed in order, so sometimes they will need to be done sequentially within the unit, at other times they are a standalone topic. It means too that you can also direct students there if they're looking at ideas for assessment tasks, if they've got a piece of research. There are examples of personality studies, examples of war, examples of continuity and change, elements of contestability. So there are lots of different samples that they can draw on to see the types of history that could be studied. On top of that, they can be used for differentiation. If you've got some students who are struggling to deal with particular concepts, or if you've got students who can't possibly take on board the whole scope of that unit, you'll often find in the case study little bits of the topic pieced together in a sample unit. And the reason why we've done this is because when you get into Year 11 and Year 12, you will have case studies that are being drawn on. Specifically in Year 11 for modern and ancient history, students have to study case studies, and what's happening is that they're applying those skills of historical thinking within those case studies. They're also perfect for extending students who might be either fast at their work or looking for more, or just need to think about different ideas. And as we move on to the next slide, I'll be able to talk to you about what I mean by some of our greatest loves coming in. So as you look at this list here, you can see that they all directly relate to the syllabus content. Now, one that might stand out to you as not necessarily having a direct correlation could be the case study on Hannibal. And I will confess that I threw this in here because my great love, Hannibal, was taken away from me from the Stage 6 Ancient History syllabus as a personality, and there's no way that I can live without him, so he had to appear somewhere. Now, you might be thinking Carthage isn't an option, but Rome is an option. And within Rome, you actually have to study contact with other societies, and in the process of that, having a look at war. So in the example of this case study, you've got a couple of things that are all intertwining to make it a really unique way of approaching history. Not only are students introduced to another ancient society, but you do have an example here that many students will not have the opportunity to study at any other point in time. There's elements of contestability. Students will be able to go beyond just the generic makeup of the army that you might have, and they can have a look at the Punic Wars in depth as well. They can also have a look at different decision makers that took place in the ancient world. And so that's a clear example of how it's an added extra, but at the same time, it actually integrates many different facets of what you would find spelled out for you in the syllabus. If we move on and have a look at the Year 8 case studies, you'll again see that these are things that people might not necessarily do automatically in their particular units. One of my favourites, for example, is responses to the Black Death. So when you're studying the Black Death, most people will have a look at the cause, the course, they will have a look at the consequences, but not necessarily the responses. So this might be an example of a case study where you've got an opportunity to extend students. It's where you could have a look at legacies, where you could have a look at impact, where you could have a look at cause and effect. And the opportunity is there for you to actually set that for students to have as independent research or further study, or it's things that you can bring in if you just need to spice up your classroom a little bit with some extra bits of information that you won't find in most of the usual approaches when you're studying these different topics. I'll hand over to Bernie to talk about the Year 9 and 10 case studies, but they too are just as exciting.
As you can see here, we've got Britain on the Move, Darcy Wentworth, convict or well-connected? Are we moving towards a post-capitalist world? Mal Meninga, finding your place in Australian history. The Taiping Rebellion, World War I on the Central Coast. So there's a wide range that fit into each chapter. And we'll look at a couple in a moment in a little bit more detail, and in Year 10 as well. The Year 10 case studies where they're on the threshold of a dream. Well, that's a Moody Blues reference if you're as old as me, otherwise senior school. And again, the role of the UN. What was Australia's first rock and roll record? Thunberg versus Trump, Davos 2020, the media response to immigration and popular music in the Vietnam War. So they're all designed to make kids interested. Find something that will stimulate them as well as meeting the needs of the syllabus. And I know we've talked a lot tonight about wanting to prepare kids for Year 12, but what's important to understand, I think more than anything, is that we really want kids to enjoy history, to actually love what they're doing, because when they go on to senior school, I think they've got a fair expectation to say, well, yeah, I'm doing modern history, I'm doing ancient history because I enjoy it. And I now know how to do it. And so we're not trying to say, this is the magic bullet and everybody's going to become a Band 6 HSC student. But what we're really trying to do is get students and challenge the whole range of students to be the best they can be. And I'll just look at to finish off, I'll just look at 3 case studies to sort of show you what we're talking about. So in our big ideas chapter, capitalism is a is a specific study, and it was fairly obvious as the lockdown hit, the pandemic spread, that, let's think about it. We've had Scott Morrison actually saying, well, you can have free childcare. We need to do this. There's a fairly dyed-in-the-wool capitalist challenging his own beliefs and values. And I looked at Paul Mason's work where he talked about in 2015 that capitalism, like most big ideas, was coming to an end. It was going to change. And that change could be accelerated by external shocks. And if you're taking a class through, rather than doing the Industrial Revolution, you're doing the isms, you would obviously be doing that to prepare them for Year 11 and 12. And this is a case study designed to make those students, that top level student, really think deeply about what they're doing. The next slide is the other side of the equation. We often have students that say, oh, there's nothing in history that I'm interested in, I just want to go out and play footy. So I've got them covered as well. Mal Meninga went through a process on the SBS Who Do You Think You Are series, at looking at his own background, his own history, to try and understand what his place was in Australian history. And it came back to, now here's a man who has destroyed New South Wales rugby league dreams for a decade, who's the 13th immortal in rugby league, yet he wasn't picked in schoolboy teams, And his mum had to take him aside and say, it's because you're too dark to be billeted. So he was very much aware he was different. He wasn't mainstream Australian, but he's gone on to be an Australian rugby league captain. And in unpacking this story, it helps students see how we all can find our place in Australian history. And that's designed for every student to be able to find access in a way where they can help themselves understand what it means to be Australian. And by looking at the South Sea Islanders, it also helps them understand why so many people got upset when Scott Morrison said earlier this year that there was never any slavery in Australia. And so it's designed to give them that depth of understanding for themselves. Here's just an example when we're looking at popular culture in Year 10. Here's a step-by-step research guide to answer the unanswerable question. What was Australia's first rock and roll record? In a class of 30, you could get 10 different answers, but it's teaching them how to research, how to refine your question, and then come to a conclusion that is supported by evidence. And if that's the gift we can give our students at the end of Year 10, that they know how to come to a conclusion and support it with evidence, I see nothing wrong with using Australia's first rock and roll record as the tool to do that. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what we really hope we've achieved with this set of books. And I'll hand you over now to Callie, who can tell you all about them. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bernie. So I'll now provide a short overview of our new Insight History series, and we'll take a look at the sample of the online teacher resource and new dashboard as well. Firstly, just to really quickly explain how we're publishing these new editions. Last year we undertook some research and spoke to teachers when we met at conferences and meetings and online surveys, etc. And we asked, would you prefer year level books or staged books? And the answer was really mixed. It was very evenly split. So in fact, what we've done is we've provided both options so that you, our customers, can really choose the best way of the way that you teach history across the New South Wales schools. So we present to you the new covers for 6 titles, publishing by Year 7 to 10, as well as at Stage 4 and Stage 5, which means that there's one book for Stage 4 and one book for Stage 5, rather than a pack containing 2 separate books. And we're really excited about this and hope that you are as well. So let's just have a look at how they're different. So the year level books include complete coverage of all depth study options in print as well as digitally, with just one exception, which is the new chapter in the Year 10 book on the Holocaust. And you can see it's there, chapter 12. The stage books include the same chapters as the year level books, but in the stage books, some chapters are digital only, available via the O-book. So in Stage 4, there are 6 online chapters, for example, Ancient Greece, Ancient India, Renaissance Italy, and in the Stage 5 book, there are 4 online-only chapters, including the aforementioned chapter on the Holocaust. So what we really wanted to be able to do today is show you how it looks in real time, and some of the resources that we've provided for you, which include, for example, teaching notes, which will give you ideas for you can cross-refer with the syllabus and help you with teaching strategies and suggested ideas, as well as the fully scoped out teaching program. And the tiles that you can see on the screen in front of you now will be they'll be colour coded, so you get used to the teacher resources teacher notes being mustered. And we've also provided all of the questions from the textbook, which are the Check Your Learning questions and the source study questions. They're all provided on templates, and they're especially useful if you're in a situation where students are sharing class sets of the texts. They can be used for homework, and they can be placed onto your learning management system or downloaded and printed. The pink web links there, they're third-party websites. I was really looking forward to showing you some of those, and we've included them because they're relevant and can be useful in saving you time surfing endlessly on the net for additional resources. The books themselves are designed around a double-page spread, and with this new edition, that matches the printed book exactly, which makes it much easier for you. And then tagged to each page spread, we have these additional resources, as I say. So here we're at the checkpoint questions, and when you get to this stage of you reach the end of the topic, you really want to check your students' knowledge and understanding. So we provide some differentiated activities. There are multiple choice quizzes that you can use at 3 different levels, and they are short quizzes that the students can take online. They get an instant result to see how they're going, so instant feedback, and that will track, or those results will report to our new Mark book. And we also provide checkpoint worksheets, which again you can download or upload to your LMS. You can print them off, and they are also at 3 different levels, and they're provided with answers. So if we can go to the next slide and just recap on everything that's in the Teacher O book. It does contain a digital copy of the book, as well as a teaching program and teaching notes, lots of answers, so really saving you lots of time there with marking, and some additional learning resources that you can use in the classroom, blackline masters and those sorts of things. New for this edition, we've got Quizlet. Oxford has partnered with Quizlet to engage students in the online space with the learning tools and games. And the new Mark book is where you can see on a dashboard the results of the quizzes to assess students' level of understanding, monitor their progress and track engagement. Teachers can filter results by class or at individual student level. And you can also add the results of your own school developed assessments to complete your Mark book if you wish. So what do we have available now for you to look at? We have sample chapters from Year 7 or Stage 4 and Year 9 Stage 5. They're available from our website. The address is on the screen. And we also have hard copies of those. So if you would like those, then our sales team's details will be available at the end of the webinar. And also the online sample, we can arrange for you to have access to that as well. In terms of pricing, we've got the stage books there, so print and digital together with 2 months access, as well as the digital price only. So Student O Book Assess is a single user digital access and typically used in a book list situation. The multi is a cost-effective institutional purchase. It's suitable for schools preferring digital resources, as in no hard copies, wanting access for every student without recurring annual costs. So it's ideal in a book hire environment, and you get 3 lots of 2 years of use. So provided to students at Year 7, and they keep it until they finish history in Year 8, and then the following year you can reassign those codes to a new cohort. The teacher resources can be purchased, but we do provide them free of charge if you book list the text or purchase class sets. And then for the year level, it's 1 year of access. So really the same structure there exactly, but you have just 1 year of access with a hard copy or digital access only. So thank you. I will now hand you back to Anne for any questions. Thank you.
I just wanted to remind everyone that if they've got any questions, they could put them in the live Q&A chat at the side of the screen. In the meantime, we've got a question from someone who's familiar to both Bernie and Emily. That's Bruce Dennett, who is the 3rd member of our very valuable author team. Bruce is wanting to know, are we saying that skills and concepts are more important than content? Emily, would you like to start off on that one?
I'd love to. So, sorry, was the question skills and content? Sorry, no. Skills and concepts more important than content.
Yes.
So for me, as I was going through this and in my everyday teaching of history, I would say that the two go hand in hand. I don't think that you can aptly teach content without embedding those historical skills and concepts, because otherwise you're just creating a body of knowledge. You're teaching facts, but whose facts are they? So I think that we want to, from a very young age, right from year 7, we're actually integrating historiography. In order to integrate historiography and historiographical approaches, we're using all of those skills, all of the concepts to make sure that students are questioning everything that is put forward to them as fact, developing their own opinions and justifying those with the evidence. So I would say that the skills and concepts are not going to be understood without content to which they then apply the skills and the concepts. And likewise, I would say that your content is dead without those historical skills and concepts. So I think the two of them go hand in hand, and you can't actually take them apart.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm so old that I can remember basically taught history as read this page, remember it, write it out again for someone. And that was never understood. That's not history. Basically, if you have history as just content, all you've got is trivia. You might know enough to be able to be a valuable member of a trivia team, but you don't really know history and you don't understand history. And that's been, my experience across far too many years in history education, both as a teacher, as a university method lecturer, that you have to combine them all together. And that's what we've tried very hard to do in this book, is to, by embedding the skills and concepts with the content, they're seen as a complete package that is, so kids are doing history, not just learning history. I guess that's the way I'd put it.
And just adding to what Bernie said there too, I think that you'll see that throughout the way the different questions have been designed, but also within the case studies. So I think that one of the most prominent features in the case studies is that issue of contestability, because we want to make sure that students have an opportunity to grapple with all of those skills intertwined into one. And I think too that with those case studies, there's an opportunity for teachers to be able to use those to model their own case studies if they would like to. So again, the content could be anything. It's the skills and the concepts that actually shape the way we are teaching history.
Great, thank you. Another question, what's the criteria for significance, and can an event be different for different people at different times?
I think that's definitely a question for Bernie. So jump in anytime, Bernie. But yeah. I would say the criteria for significance is actually going to change depending on the particular topic. I think too that what is significant for one may not be significant for others, and that's where we really do need to rely on those historical skills and concepts of empathetic understanding, perspectives, because people are going to see things quite differently.
Yeah. I guess that's what I was trying to show in that example I used on human rights and the Charter of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, and saying, well, why is it significant? Who is it significant for? Is it significant because it's such an important document, because someone says so, because the United Nations put it out, or because it's actually helped people in different parts of the world? So, I don't think you can come down. We understand that things are significant, but trying to make them as a still, stoned, straight out, they never change, that just doesn't work. Significance is changing depending on audience, depending on interpretation, depending on perspective. It's not something that's set in stone.
Thank you. Another one, should teachers be encouraged to design their own case studies?
Absolutely. That's what we touched on just a second ago. I think that if teachers use the framework that we've presented, they'll have ample opportunities to have a look at either personalities, contested issues in history, different cause and effect events that have happened. And you can absolutely, the idea behind the textbooks is not to tell you exactly what you need to be doing, not to tell your students what to think, but to shape that love of learning, that love of history, and to shape pedagogical approaches. So hopefully what teachers will be able to do is take the resource that we have and extrapolate different parts of the textbook at different times to formulate their own case studies if they would like to, depending on the time constraints and the program scope and sequencing that they have within their school context.
Yes, and I'd even argue that you can encourage students to do their own small case studies and put them in control of their learning, because as Emily said, those case studies do represent in quite a few cases things that we were really interested in. Some of them had to be there because there was a point that needed to be unpacked, but some of those were very much about, I found that Mal Meninga, I happened to watch that Who Do You Think You Are, and thought, wow, this has got to be out there. This has taught me so much about understanding myself just by watching this. I want to share this with kids. Now, I would bet that if you're a history student, you're going to walk into your classroom, whatever the topic you're doing, with some passion, some idea. That passion makes a perfect case study. You know, I would encourage you, and as Emily said, time is of the essence as a history teacher, trying to fit everything in that you have to do, along with all your other jobs on any given day. But they don't need to be long, they don't need to be elaborate. They could be built around a skill or a concept or a syllabus dot point. They can be built around yours or your students' passions. And I know there's been lots of times in my teaching career where I've done some little case study because a student desperately, there might have been one kid, and the reason they were doing history because they wanted to learn more about everything from Robin Hood to Nelson Mandela. And you can do that, and don't feel that you can't. Don't think that this textbook is the Bible you have to follow. I would like to think of it as a roadmap where, you can go off and stay at a service station and go, oh, that's pretty nifty, and go off to the side there and over here. Because you're teaching it, they're your students. We've tried to create a resource that will work for all students at all ability levels, but you know your class, and I would really encourage you to try and do that, because I can tell you putting together case studies can be real fun. It really can.
And just adding to what Bernie has said there as well, one thing that I don't think we have mentioned is that a lot of the case studies, and in fact many different things throughout the textbook, even if you're not studying that particular topic, could be used in the Year 7 history mystery, the historical investigation that takes place as part of the Investigating the Ancient Past part of the syllabus. So there are lots of opportunities for you to do case studies as a standalone type thing without having to study the whole unit. And while I have the utmost respect for Bernie, I would like to just put out there and say that this is also a textbook that I would happily take and use in order to drive my scope and sequence and my program. So while we absolutely want it to be a foundation and a starting point for teachers to make and create their own, I feel very confident in what we have put into that textbook, that all of the skills, the knowledge, the content, and the concepts that I want my students to be using, I feel that they're handed to us as teachers on a platter right there. So I would be very happy to use that even as a single resource, although of course we're always going to be bringing in a variety of different things to support our teaching and learning.
Thanks very much, Emily. We'll wrap up now. Thank you to Bernie and Emily and Kelly for a really interesting session. If you'd like to learn more about Inside History or see view full sample pages, you can contact your local secondary education consultant. That's Kelly James, Sandra McLaughlin or Kath Stevenson. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a lovely evening. Good night.